Wine Stories, a podcast to discover the world of wine by Etienne Pommier.
Hello everyone, my name is Etienne Pommier. I am the wine expert of Les Caves du Lac in Nancy, France, and I welcome you to my podcast, Wine Stories. In this podcast, I will make you discover the world of wine through journeys from famous vineyards to the most unexpected terroirs, tasting the world's greatest wines as well as affordable and easy drinking bottles, and talking about those who make wine, its culture, and its history. And please don't forget that the abuse of alcohol is harmful to your health, so consume wine responsibly. For this first episode, I have chosen to present you the story of arguably the most famous wine counterfeiter of all times, Rudy Kurniawan. In order to help you understand this complex case, I will first tell you the story of this wine forger from his rise through the years of plenty until his fall in 2012, and in a second podcast, I will come back in details on the mechanisms of this huge fraud, talking about the victims or those who might have benefited, encouraged, or even helped Kurniawan in his scheme. In order to make this podcast, I have used Peter Hellman's book In Vino Duplicitas, published in 2017 in New York by The Experiment, and I have also used the evidence seized by the FBI and copied with their authorization by leading authentication expert Maureen Darney, who I thank for her contribution. So here is the first part of the story of Rudy Kurniawan, the fine wines counterfeiter. It is December 10th, 2013, in the heart of Manhattan, in courtroom 12D of the Southern District on 500 Pearl Street. The man standing in front of the court is in his 40s. He looks elegant with his grey hair and his dark suit. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Jason Hernandez. In front of him on the stand is FBI Special Agent James Wynn explaining the search he conducted on March 8, 2012 in the suburbs of Los Angeles. When we entered the house, there were bottles everywhere on the floor and on the shelves. Wine boxes and wooden cases were piling in the hall, and the windows were covered with foil to conceal the inside of the house from people in the street. There were bottles soaking in the kitchen sink. You could see tools to uncork bottles and drawers filled with wine labels from famous producers. All in all, the FBI agents find over 19,000 wine labels, some artificially aged, copying the world's greatest wines, dozens of jars of glue and sealing wax, piles of antique paper, buckets filled with old corks, stencils and stamps to replicate branding of corks and wooden cases, and more than 200 fake bottles in production. So when the defense attorney explains that his client gathered all these labels to decorate the walls of his new house, there are people laughing in the courtroom, and even Judge Richard Berman can barely hide his skepticism. To be honest, his task is especially difficult, since the evidence against his client is overwhelming. His client is right here, sitting on the bench as the accused. He is a 47-year-old Indonesian man with short dark hair, wearing rectangular glasses with a thick black frame. In front of the public and the jury, he looks calm and doesn't seem to realize what is at stake here. He faces 40 years in prison for mail fraud and wire fraud. His name is Rudy Kurniawan, and is considered the most notorious wine forger of all times. Like other fraudsters before him, he has built for himself over the years a reputation of high-end collector thanks to remarkable social skills, as well as a clever web of lies that allowed him to deceive wine buyers, merchants and experts, not only in the US, but also in the UK or in Hong Kong. But who is he really? First of all, his real name isn't Rudy Kurniawan, but Zhen Wang Hong. He was born on October 10, 1976 in Jakarta, and it's his father, of Chinese descent, who will get him a passport under that name. He arrives in the US in the mid-90s with a student visa and studies at the University of California. In 2001, at 25 years of age, he moves with his mother to a house on 9638 East Naomi Avenue in Arcadia, a Chinese residential neighborhood in the outskirts of Los Angeles. It's around that time that he discovers wine, tasting Californian bottlings from Napa and Sonoma, and he will later explain that his first wine emotion was a 1995 Opus One. In Los Angeles, he meets two wine merchants, Kyle Smith and Paul Wasserman, from the Woodland Hills Wine Company, who introduce him to Bordeaux and Burgundy wines. Soon, he starts buying almost compulsively and is often seen in auctions. During that time, he often buys over $500,000 worth of wines per month. In 2001, he files a request for asylum in the United States, which will eventually be denied by the Immigration Department in 2003. From this moment on, he is illegally staying in the US. In the early 2000s, he meets an auctioneer as young and ambitious as himself, John Capon. Capon is the son of a New York wine merchant who failed to become a hip-hop producer and has come back to the family business named Acker Merrill & Condit. He ambitions to turn this Upper West Side wine store established in 1820 into a leading international auction house. Thanks to him, Kurniawan will meet high-end New York wine collectors ready to spend fortunes to buy like trophies the rarest wines and vintages. They have a club named the 12 Angry Men, and they meet during extravagant evenings where everyone brings wines on top of the bottles ordered from the restaurants for dinners that can cost over $20,000 per head. Each one has a nickname. There's Big Boy, the Cardinal, or the Punisher. For Rudy, it will be Dr. Conti, after the Grand Cru he claims to be his favorite, or Mr. 47, for the legendary Bordeaux vintage, of which his collection seems bottomless. He calls it his magic cellar. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times published in December 2006, he reveals having about 50,000 bottles and explains that it is Capon that advises him and helps him in his purchases. He got me into wine. He would tell me what to do, what to buy. Now it's a disease. There's always something I want to try, something I don't know. This magic cellar is the envy of his friends, who see him bring to dinners bottles every time rarer and more incredible, in an atmosphere that Wine Spectator journalist Paul Hellman describes as cockfights. Dinners where tasting exceptional wines was almost less important than showing you could find and buy these extraordinary bottles. Like in this picture, where Rudy Kurniawan is being poured a questionable 1945 Romanée-Conti in a beer glass with a cheeky smile on his face. It is a game. Who can bring the most unbelievable wine? And thanks to his magic cellar, Rudy often wins. In order to blend in this group of young and wealthy collectors, Rudy will embrace their codes and their lifestyle. With a Patek Philippe Nautilus on his wrist and Amex Centurion card in his pocket, Kurniawan spends over $500,000 in Hermes suits in 2 years, buys an $8 million mansion in Bel Air, one of LA's most high-profile areas, and acquires art pieces by Damien Hirst or Andy Warhol. In the 2009 movie Up in the Air, directed by Jason Reitman, the character portrayed by George Clooney aims to achieve 10 million miles on his airline membership card to be the only 7th person to do it. As a comparison, in 2008, at the age of 32, Rudy already has 26 million miles on his flying membership card and could travel around the world in first class free of charge. For his mom's birthday, he rents out restaurant Melis in Santa Monica, and in the middle of the evening, one of his guests, action movie star Jackie Chan, grabs a magnum of Petrus and gets on his chair to shout across the room, "Rudy, you're the best!" All those who met him in those years describe him as charming, friendly, and generous. He's got money, he has fine wines, and he likes to share them. Where does the money come from? When asked, he avoids the question and vaguely mentions a beer distribution business in Asia, but doesn't reveal the true origin of the family wealth that supposedly gives him a $1 to $2 million monthly allowance. In 2006, he decides to auction part of his stock during 2 sales organized by Acker Merrill & Condit and his friend John Capon. Capon calls these sales the Cellar 1 and 2 and presents Rudy's collection as probably the best seller on the planet. Overall, 12,000 bottles for a total of $35 million. Here are some of the most prestigious lots. Two 12-bottle cases of 1945 Mouton Rothschild for $155,000 each. One 6-liter Methuselah of 1978 Romani Conti for $125,000. 6 magnums of 1947 Cheval Blanc for $120,000. Or 6 bottles of Roumier Bonnemar 1923 for $113,000. The Cellar 2 generates over $25 million in sales, beating the previous wine auction record from 1999 and remains, to this day, the biggest sale ever made for a single wine collector. But the veneer is cracking, and doubts start to emerge amongst collectors about the provenance and authenticity of Rudy's wines. Some are intrigued that he asks sommeliers in the restaurants where he hosts his dinners to send him back by FedEx all the empty bottles, unwashed, and with all the corks to take pictures. But mainly, it is the fact that his cellar seems bottomless that astonishes the most seasoned collectors, some of whom have been buying since before he was born and know only too well how difficult it is to find these bottles on the market. In April 2007, the catalogue of the Christie's auction held in Los Angeles presents on its cover 2 magnums of a Pomerol icon, Chateau Le Pin 1982, consigned by Rudy Kurniawan. Seeing the catalogue and realizing the forgery, the producer alerts the auction house and asks for the bottles to be pulled out. The same year, American billionaire William Corr files a complaint against another collector, Eric Greenberg, for having sold him counterfeit wines, and files another one in 2008 against Akemerol & Condit for conducting the sale. It would later appear that Greenberg had bought the wines from Kurniawan's magic cellar. But it's in 2008 that things will get worse for Rudy at the Aker auction held in New York on April 25th. Browsing the catalogue a few days before the sale, American collector Douglas Barzolet is intrigued to find several Grand Crus from famous Burgundy producer Domaine Ponceau in vintages never seen before, including 30 years of Clos Saint-Denis from 1945 to 1971. So he calls the owner Laurent Ponceau. The first vintage of Clos Saint-Denis made by the Domaine is 1982, so it is absolutely impossible for these bottles to be genuine. Inspecting the catalogue, the vigneron realizes that over the 100+ bottles to be auctioned, only one of them looks authentic. Furious, he calls Akemerol & Condit and asks John Capon for the bottles to be pulled out of the cell. In the end, Capon reluctantly agrees, but in order to make sure that the bottles are not being sold, Ponceau flies to New York and goes to the auction. And it's only when he's being told that the producer is in the room that Capon, who has never met him before, informs the crowd that all the Ponceau bottles worth over $1 million are pulled out. In the following days, Laurent Ponceau meets Douglas Barzolet, John Capon, and Rudy Kurniawan for lunch in a fine dining outlet in New York City, and questions the auctioneer and the seller about the wines. Kurniawan's explanations are vague. He says that he doesn't keep track of all the wines he buys because there are too many and that he needs to check his files. But this defensive attitude during the meeting suggests to Ponceau that the person he's talking to maybe isn't just a collector who was taken advantage of, but possibly part of a fraudulent scheme. His suspicions are confirmed 3 months later when they meet again in Los Angeles, and the young Indonesian tells him that the bottles were bought from one Pak Endra in Asia and gives him 2 phone numbers. As it will soon turn out, Pak Endra is a fake name, and the phone numbers correspond to the hotline of Indonesia's low-cost airline Lion Air. From this moment on, the Burgundian will start investigating and follow several leads from the US to Asia via Burgundy and Scandinavia. For 2 years, he looks for clues and evidence without knowing that the FBI is also investigating Kurniawan. In 2009, when billionaire William Corr learns that the wines he bought were originally from Rudy, he files a complaint against him, and things turn really sour for Dr. Conti, who is now being pointed out in the United States. Meanwhile, the FBI keeps searching and gets in touch with Laurent Ponceau, who handles them the results of his private investigation. Documents that support the pieces already assembled by the agency and lead to Kurniawan as a suspected wine counterfeiter. In 2012, while a new sale is being organized in London on February 8th by English auction house Vanquish Wines and American partner Spectrum Wine Auctions, California-based lawyer and collector Don Cornwell posts a long message on the Wine Berserkers blog. He doubts the authenticity of several bottles apparently consigned by Rudy Kurniawan via a middleman named Antonio Castanos. Among the lots, 2 bottles of 1978 Romanée-Conti with a label supposedly from London merchant Percy Fox, but labels that contain a typo in the address. Facing suspicion, Vanquish and Spectrum deny categorically that the bottles come from Kurniawan, but eventually pull them out of the sale. Castanos, the owner of a Los Angeles restaurant, will later testify in court that he was acting on Rudy's behalf and that both merchants knew the true provenance of the bottles. A few weeks later, Rudy is arrested in his home in Arcadia, and the agents discover his workshop. In front of the cops, he chooses to remain silent and assist quietly while all the pieces of evidence are being seized. Concerned about the suspect fleeing the country, authorities send him to prison without possible bail until his trial, planned for December 2013. At the trial, some of the producers counterfeited by Kurniawan testify, such as Christophe Roumier, who explains that the famous lot of Bonnemar 1923 sold at the Cellar 2 sale for over $110,000 cannot exist since the domain started producing only in 1924. Aubert de Villaine from Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and Laurent Ponceau also testified, while expert Michael Egan unfolds Kurniawan's production techniques based on the elements found in his home. For example, labels were cooked in the oven to make them look falsely aged. Sometimes, the bottles were simply refilled with a mix of other wines to trick potential buyers. For instance, in order to brew a 1945 Mouton Rothschild, Kurniawan would blend 50% Château Cos d'Estournel 1988 from Saint-Estèphe, 25% Château Palme 1990 from Margaux, and 25% young Californian wines to give the wine the freshness and the fruit punch that amazed his clients. For a 1950s Romanée-Conti, he would blend recent vintages of Californian Pinot Noir with old and tired Burgundies bought at a cheap price on the market. After a week of trial, Kurniawan is eventually declared guilty of mail fraud and wire fraud by the jury and will later be sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, $20 million in punishment, and $28.4 million in restitution. Hearing the verdict, he doesn't show his emotions, but he, who thought he could get away with it, seems to start realizing as he goes back to prison. So here it is, the story of Rudy Kurniawan as it was told by the press back then. The story of a young and gifted wine lover who became the #1 counterfeiter in wine history. But many questions remain unanswered. Was Rudy truly gifted and a tasting genius? Where did the money he used to start buying and counterfeiting come from? Did he really craft all these bottles on his own in his kitchen, or did he have accomplices? And what about the merchants, experts, and collectors who sold, vetted, and praised these improbable wines over the years? Were they the victims of the counterfeiter, or did they enable or even help him for their own profit? To answer all these questions and discover where the actors of this story are today, stay tuned for the second part of this podcast about Rudy Kurniawan, the fine wines counterfeiter.